Bill March. Many of you will remember Bill from his presentation he gave to us in April 2021 on the RCF's involvement in the Aleutian campaign. He served almost 42 years with the Canadian Forces in RCAF, both as a navigator on maritime patrol aircraft and as a staff officer in Canada, Europe, and Afghanistan. During his time in uniform, he also spent 10 years as the Air Force historian. Bill is a graduate of the Royal Military College and the University of Victoria, and is currently pursuing his PhD in history at Queen's University on the subject of tonight's presentation. He has taught undergraduate courses in history at RMC and has written or edited numerous articles and publications on air power history. He is also on the editorial board for the Canadian Aviation Historical Society Journal and is a contributing editor for Air Force magazine. Please join me in welcoming Bill March.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me again. I figured after my last presentation, you would have had enough of me. Before I start tonight's presentation, though, I just want to make an announcement of interest. I got to spend some nerd time with Professor Michael Deal from Memorial University out in Deseronto over the course of August and September, where we were doing an archaeological site survey on Camp Rathbun, which was one of the old RAF airfields that has been virtually untouched since it was closed down in 1919. And it was really an awful lot of fun, found some really cool stuff, and it'll be the subject of an article that's coming out in the next issue of Air Force magazine. So if you're interested in the First World War, it's some good information in there. So I'm going to just take a minute here and share my screen. And hopefully everybody can see it. Can you just confirm that you can see her?
Yep, I can see it just fine.
Great. So what this is really, it's an overview of the work I've been doing with respect to my my doctorate and stuff. So it's very much a work in progress. So as the title says, I'm going to be taking a look at the RCF and the occupation of Germany right after the war. And I got interested in this subject about, almost 20 years ago when I was taking a course in history with Jack Granitstein. And so I sort of asked, what was the Canadian Army doing after the war? And he says, they were drinking beer and chasing German girls. And I went, well, they were over there for quite a time, and there was an awful lot of them. So even though I'm sure that went on, I was sort of curious as to what else might have been happening. And that led me into discovering, frankly, that the RCF had quite a large contingent there for the occupation of Germany. And so that's sort of what started me down the pathway of doing research on this. So this is why I sort of am looking at this topic. From my perspective, it's the largest non-combat deployment of Canadian forces ever. We're talking almost 40,000 Canadians that spent, in some cases, a year and a half after the war in Germany. Now, obviously, you can take a look at this as a continuation of the wartime commitment, but it is very much a distinct operation or distinct military function on its own. I also started this when I was in uniform. So I was looking at the applicability of what we did in Germany in 45 and 46 to what we were doing in Afghanistan, or what we had been doing in the former Yugoslavia and stuff like this. I was also sort of hoping that I get some ideas with respect to what possible military roles or roles there might be for the RCF or the Canadian Air Force or Canadian air element of the Canadian forces in those days, as to what we might be able to doing if we weren't dropping bombs and breaking things. Also, I was really curious to see if I could learn anything about the political deliberations, the organization, and how we both deployed and redeployed back home as to what we were doing currently and in future operations. And finally, my big thing is we tend to think of, when we look at the Second World War or look at any war, we tend to focus almost primarily on the combat operations, and we don't really take a good look about what happens right at the end of the war, whether we're disengaging coming home or whether we have a role with the country that we have defeated or the failed state that we're trying to happen. So it's always taking a look beyond the end of the combat operation. So all of those things are what interested me when I took a look at this particular topic. So I want to talk a minute about sources. So fundamentally, most of my sources ended up being in the United Kingdom, primarily at Kew, although I did use the RAF historian and stuff like this. I already mentioned Matt Yost was a big help with respect to the files that were here within the Directorate of History, and of course, Library and Archives Canada had some. But the vast majority of the sources that I tapped into were all held in the United Kingdom, which is understandable considering that the vast majority of the time that we spent over in Europe, most of the operations, most of the things the Canadians were doing were under British command or British direction. Secondary sources, I tapped into the British, the American, and to some extent the German sources, although the Germans are the worst of the bunch because there was not a lot of record keeping in May, June, July of August 1945 for some very good reasons. And it's only after that you start getting some anecdotal histories and stuff like this. What is really absent from all of these sources that I've tapped into are Canadian sources. There's very little out there on the Canadians right after the war, and even less on what was happening with respect to the Air Force right after the war. Kosternuck and Griffin is probably one of the better sources, if you will. And we're only now starting to see some material come out here from that are looking primarily at the Canadian Army Occupation Force and primarily what they were doing in Holland rather than what they were doing in Germany. But there's really not an awful lot from the Canadian perspective. So this is what I'm going to be talking about tonight very quickly. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the planning, the Allied, British, and Canadian planning that went into it. A little bit about the organization and issues surrounding primarily the RCAF, its contributions and stuff like this. And then taking a good look in a little bit more detail about the primary tasks. So we're going to be talking about air policing, transport, disarmament, a little bit about war crimes and stuff. And then I'll give you some concluding thoughts and show you some of the holes that I still have to try to fill as we go along. So here we have the Allied planning that basically went into the primary guidance when it came to the occupation of Germany. So basically the big two in Casablanca, because Stalin was a little busy in 1943, and then finally Yalta in 1945. These two meetings really set up the framework for what was going to underlie Allied planning for the occupation of Germany. And what we were really talking about here is we're talking about the agreement on the invasion of Europe and agreement on unconditional surrender for Germany. There were not going to be any repeats of the First World War, if you will. They were going to go for total defeat of Germany this time. And they also wanted to focus on unconditional surrender, especially in 1943, as a political prop for Stalin, who was in the middle of fighting for the Soviet Union's life at the time. So those are the two big conferences that are going to lay out the framework for what's going to drive the military planning for the occupation of Germany. And these are going to be the guiding principles. Total defeat, like I already mentioned, it's going to be complete disarmament. There's not going to be 100,000 manned Reich there at the end of the Second World War. It's going to be complete disarmament. They're going to destroy the Nazi Party. If you were a member of the Nazi Party, if you're a card-carrying member, then your future would be rather bleak and stuff. They're going to lay the foundations for rule of law and democracy as it is interpreted by the various victor nations. And finally, they're going to encourage individual and collective responsibility. So those are going to be the primary guiding principles that are going to drive the military planning for the occupation of Germany. So Allied military planning from 1943 to 1945 basically followed these three steps. You're going to hear basically Rankin, Talisman, and Eclipse. Rankin was the first plan. It commenced in 1943, and it basically had three segments, A, B, and C, whereas basically A was a sudden collapse of Germany. They just threw up their hands in 1943 and said, I quit. B was they were going to fight all the way back to the borders of Germany, and C was basically they were going to decimate Germany, and they would have to occupy Germany in its thing. So Rankin C is basically called for the systemic occupation and disarmament of the entire country. And if you think about it, that is a massive operation on its own right. Yes, the war and everything took all this planning and this massive undertaking, but the occupation and control of every aspect of a nation is also a massive undertaking. So that was Rankin. Talisman came in 1944, and it was fundamentally a change in name because Rankin had been leaked. The code name Rankin had been leaked, and so the Allies just decided, okay, we're just going to change the name and call it Talisman. And finally, Eclipse is the final plan, and it defined the occupation zones in occupied Germany. It basically stated that there would be phases, where basically phase 1 was the finish of combat, phase 2 was the regrouping into national zones, and then phase 3 would be after everybody grouped into national zones in occupied Germany. That would carry on in there. If you take a look at the Commonwealth commitment as they planned back in 1943, those are the numbers I had there. The British estimated that only in the British zone of occupation, it would take 12 divisions, 28 squadrons, and a shore-based personnel of approximately 2,000 people. So that's a massive undertaking for Great Britain at the time, when they were pretty well scraping the bottom of the personnel and manpower barrel. So that's going to be the driving force. And although there's some tinkering with the numbers, that's going to be what the British are planning on. They are counting on a Commonwealth commitment to the occupation of Germany to relieve some of their personnel pressures. And they're going to exert that sort of pressure on Canada, especially, in order for them to pony up some troops and some air personnel. So the British started planning for the occupation of Germany in 1940, which I thought was pretty optimistic on their part, that they figured, oh yeah, in 1940, well, we know we're going to win. We don't know when we're going to win, but we're going to plan for what we're going to do with them. And the Canadians got invited to the table in 1943. The Brits did a pretty good job of keeping the Commonwealth informed, but from a Canadian perspective, we are almost entirely reliant on British sources of information when it comes to the plans for the occupation, what the big three are talking about for the occupation and defeat of Germany. Because even though we are a major player, especially up until 1942, when the Americans really come into the war, we are very much a junior player, both by a point of view of the big three and by deliberate government policy under Mackenzie King. So we are almost totally reliant on British information. Now the British, of course, they're fighting in Europe, but they also have a big problem in the Far East. And they're also very concerned about how the spheres of influence are going to impact post-war Europe. Although Churchill makes a big deal about supporting Russia and everything, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, there's no doubt that he's also concerned about what's going to happen after the war with respect to the Soviet Union. But their biggest problem, their biggest consideration when it comes to those 28 divisions and air squadron and everything is going to be personnel. They just don't have the people left anymore. From a Canadian perspective, what's going to be driving our input and our planning are bringing the Canadians back home as soon as we can, because by the time 1945 rolls around, there will be some Canadians that have been away from the country for 5 years plus. So they want to bring them back, and this is a very big political imperative. Demobilization, they want to bring everybody back, and they want to make sure that there's not a repeat of what is perceived as a lack of proper support for reintegration into the civilian country for the people from the First World War. So they want to bring them back, and they want to make sure that demobilization goes efficiently, quickly, and everything. And then finally, although most people tend not to focus on that, Canada is still at war. We still have a small number of forces in the Far East, and so there is that planning for sending a much larger contingent, both Army and Air Force, to the war. So those are going to be the three primary aspects of Canadian planning when it comes to all this. Then there is a bit of a political turmoil. You have a Department of External Affairs who are flexing their muscles, if you will, and you have Mackenzie King, the ultimate politician. Now, I'm a card-carrying conservative. I'm not a big fan of liberals, just the way I was brought up. And I always thought that Mackenzie King was, sort of a lackluster politician until I really started to study him as a historian. And he was brilliant as far as I'm concerned. Perhaps not the kind of war leader that I would have loved to have had as a Canadian. However, as a politician and as someone who's looking out for the best interests of the country, I'd be hard pressed to find an individual who was as good as he was. However, he had so much on his plate that he almost gave free rein to the individuals that are in the Department of External Affairs. So you got Lester B. Pearson, Hume Wrong, and Norm Roberts here, if you go from my perspective from left to right. So these three individuals came up with this aspect of functionalism. And functionalism means that if we contribute to an organization or to a commitment, then we deserve a right to a voice in how that commitment or how that organization is going to function. So the principle of functionalism. Now, they believed that they wanted Canada to have a bigger role in international politics, international affairs, consummate with the contributions we were making to the war effort. So they took a look at the contributions to the occupation of Germany as our cards to play in order for us to get a voice in how post-war Europe would be organized, post-war Europe would be dealt with. King was not so sure. He was willing to let them pursue that, but his support would have been relatively lackluster at the best of times. But so you have these two sort of opposing points of view in government. You have the Department of External Affairs who really wanted Canada involved, and yet King, who was willing to sort of go along with it, but that wasn't really what he was focused on. He was focused more on things like internal national politics, the United Nations, that sort of stuff. But he was always and had always been leery of any sort of external commitments from the perspective of military forces and stuff. So you got these two opposing sort of political aspects of the planning that went on. Now, from a RCAF perspective, the staff planning between the RCF and the RAF was pretty good. We kept each other. I mean, a lot of them knew each other from the First World War. There had been the exchanges during the interwar period and stuff like this. And then our chief of the air staff, after Bredner left in 44 and went overseas, was basically Leckie, and Leckie had served in the RAF for most of his career and stuff. So it was pretty good. But these are the two senior officers that are going to really drive the RCF planning and the RCF commitments here. So it took almost a year and a half for the government of Canada to reach a decision. The numbers fluctuated depending on the debates, but on the 11th December 1944, a decision was reached. So the Army was going to contribute fundamentally what was a reinforced division. They were going to be composed of low priority personnel. In other words, there was a point system in order to bring people back, coupled with, if you're going to go overseas or if you're going to go to the Far East and fight, you get home early, and a whole lot of other criteria to get you home quick. But basically, it was low priority personnel, and then finally volunteers. The Air Force, we were going to provide 11 squadrons in total, and I'll break those down a little further later. But again, it was low priority personnel, volunteers, but we also had an aspect that we were providing specialist personnel, and those came in the realm of air disarmament that I'll speak to later. So in total, you're going to have almost 40,000 Canadians that are going to have a job to do as of the 9th of May, 1945. Now, from the perspective of a Canadian commitment, this number is roughly 4 times the size of the pre-war military permanent force in Canada. And its budget is estimated at $100 million to keep this force overseas. So that's 2.5 times the pre-war budget. So that's an unbelievable post-war commitment, military commitment, the Canadian government's willing to make. At this time too, you should understand, or people should realize, that there's also a big national crisis that's happening, the conscription crisis. It has cost Chubby Powers, he basically resigns and stuff, so we get a series of caretaker air ministers in there, if you will. There's also the government, like I said, trying to push everybody home, trying to reintegrate them. There's still all this planning that's going on with respect to Canada's air commitment to the Far East, which will be Tiger Force. And then finally, if you've got all of these people overseas and you've got all these people committed to Tiger Force, you still have to maintain a rather sizable training and support organization for the Air Force back in Canada. So all of these aspects are going to drive the final planning details, the final deployment details, and basically it's going to drive what happens to the occupation force as it spends more time overseas. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the organization and issues of the RCF commitment in its total. So even though they had initially planned that the occupation force was going to be entirely on its own, they very quickly realized that phase one, in other words, the immediate disarmament and processing of German forces in the field, was going to have to be done by Allied forces in the field. So from an air perspective, that's going to be handled by the 2nd Tactical Air Force. And they create their own organization. It's going to be Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces Rear will actually create a disarmament cell or disarmament division there. And they're the ones that are actually going to be driving the air disarmament and the disarmament and all that sort of stuff right at the very beginning. Because they have no choice. They just don't have the people to set up 2 massive organizations. As well, they're also going to be the field force that's going to deal with what we would call today the non-government commitments there, such as the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, because they very quickly realize that once they go in there, they're going to have a problem with refugees, forced workers, all this sort of stuff that someone has to deal with. And so the military very quickly wants as much help as they can, such as through UNRWA. And finally, the idea of establishing military government, which is a fascinating subject on its own, where once the Allied forces go in, until such time as they can denazify the local government, or until such time as there are civilian functionaries that can deal with the civilian government, then the military is going to function as the government, de facto government. So you'll have things like majors running towns and things and stuff like this. There'll be the Burgermeister, the mayor, and so they'll deal with all that sort of stuff. And there has been, I've identified, but I don't have a lot of them, I've identified one RCF major that may in fact have been a Burgermeister of a German town. But I have to do some more research on that particular individual. As I mentioned before, it's going to get divided up into national zones. So fundamentally, you have the British zone in the orange, the Soviet zone in the pink, and the American zone in the yellow. Now, you should notice that in the British zone, you have one little sliver of yellow named Bremen, and that was because the US wanted a port, and so the British said, okay, you can have Bremen. And so they have that little chunk there. And you'll also notice the French zone, which was added in 1945. So those are the 4 national zones. And from the perspective of the Canadian Army at the point in time, it worked out for us because those were the areas in northern Germany, northwestern Germany, that we actually were at when the war ended on the 8th of May. So the Canadian Army occupation zone is in that little green chunk of the British zone. Okay, and it's going to be commanded by Chris Vokes, who's going to take over the division and stuff, the 3rd Canadian Division, that's going to be the core element of the Canadian Army occupation force. If you've ever read Vokes's biography, which is not really a great book, but it does come across that he's not very happy that he gets stuck with this job, because he figures all the other Army generals are jockeying for important positions back home in Canada, and he gets stuck over here in Europe and stuff. But that's going to be the Canadian, the COAF zone. Now, from the perspective of what will become the British Air Forces of Occupation, its initial commander is going to be Cecil Douglas, should be well known to all of the aviation historians here. And it's going to be organized and set up under the Allied quadpartite control, or 4-person control for machinery of Germany. And if you take a look at the little org chart there, it shows you basically how it's going to work. So you're going to have the British Air Element, the Air Division, and you're going to have the British Air Forces of Occupation, and then finally goes down to the Air Zone headquarters and down to the 4-group headquarters and stuff like this. Those are just notional. The thing to note here are the colored lines. So basically, all of the colored lines would tell you the political, the quadpartite lines of control, and sort of the operational lines of control. What you don't see in there is you don't see any lines of control that speaks to any of the other forces other than the British forces. So this is very much a British run operation, and all of the Canadians and Allied contributions and stuff are going to fall under British control, British guidance, British policy for the duration of their stay in Europe, much like had happened during the Second World War. So these are going to be the two Canadian senior air officers that are going to be the primary players in this. On the left, you've got Leckie, who's at Air Command headquarters in Ottawa. So he's going to be the one dealing with King and Cabinet and all those fun things that are going to be happening there. And on the right-hand side here, pictured as an Air Commodore, you have Geo Johnson, who's going to be the commanding officer of RCF Overseas Headquarters. And he's actually going to be the guy who deals with all these issues in the field and stuff. But both of these guys have other things to worry about other than the occupation forces. So Leckie obviously has got to deal with post-war planning and everything and stuff like this, and what's going to happen after after the state of emergency is ended. And Johnson is trying to do primarily a whole bunch of different things other than just the occupation forces. He's got to bring the Canadian airmen home. He's got to disentangle the RCAF from the RAF, because one of the priorities now is it's going to be a national commitment, not an allied commitment. So we want to make sure all the Canadians are brought into Canadian units. He's got to find and get everybody back home for Tiger Force. And oh yes, oh, by the way, he still has to run the organization that's over there. So both of these guys are very, very busy and very, very fragmented in the amount of time and attention they can spend to the Canadian occupation force. So this is going to be basically the various chains of command that the RCF has to deal with. So what you have is you have RCF headquarters in London, and they're going to deal with Bomber Command and Transport Command. We have 4 squadrons assigned to Bomber Command, and we have 4 squadrons assigned to Transport Command. So that's that, we have to deal with that one. Then you've got the British Air Forces Occupation Headquarters in Berlin, Germany. They're responsible for 5 squadrons, 5 Canadian squadrons. You've got the British Air Division, again in Berlin, Germany. They're going to be looking after disarmament. And then finally you have the RCF headquarters in London, and they're going to do administration, war crimes, all that stuff that is a pure RCF concern. So it's a very fragmented chain of command, which makes doing research on these guys very, very interesting, because there's not one-stop shop. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the things and stuff that we're doing. So obviously, right at the end of the war, people are coming home. They want to get the Canadians home as quickly as they can. It's a point system, and there's a big push to withdraw all the Canadians from RAF units and stuff like this. So what this means is there's a constant turnover in personnel, depending on whether or not you have points, whether or not you volunteer to be part of the Tiger Force, whether, I don't know, whether your mother's Aunt Matilda is in the hospital. All these are good reasons for you to come home early. So as a result is what you find is whoever is in charge one day may not be in charge the next. And those key personnel that you might have are very quickly being replaced by people who do not have the same skill sets, because the most experienced people tend to be the ones that have been overseas the longest, and they're the ones coming home the quickest and stuff. So this is a constant sense of disorganization, a constant sense of relearning everything that's going on. These are the primary RCF roles. So you got Bomber Command Strike Force, the British Air Force's occupation, Transport Command, Air Disarmament, and then War Crimes. So all of the Canadian squadrons, there are going to be 4 of them, the numbers are listed there, are going to belong to one group, and they're going to be based out of England. This group basically exists for one purpose and one purpose only, and if that's the Germans pop up, if there's any resistance, or if there's any armed resistance, then these guys will go over and basically drop bombs on them. So it's like playing whack-a-mole. So if there's anything that pops up, then they're going to be the ones that knock them back down. So they're going to be based out of these 3 bases primarily and everything and stuff like this. And there's not an awful lot for these individuals to do. They are all equipped with Lank Mark 1s or Mark 3s, and they basically conduct their operations, fly their training missions and everything. But fundamentally, there is not a lot of operational missions for these guys to do. The British Air Forces of occupation are located in Germany, and they consist of 126 Fighter Wing, and those 4 squadrons you see listed there, plus 1 AOP squadron that is supporting the Army in Holland and stuff like this. They're fundamentally doing what we would call now an air presence. So they're there to, again, if there's any armed resistance, is to be at the force in being. However, fundamentally, they conduct training missions. They obviously go hunting, as you can see from the picture. But again, there is not fundamentally a lot of action for these guys. And they're based out of, I want to say Untersen in Germany. And again, like I said on that picture on the right, it's fundamentally an air presence. So they show of force. They make an awful lot of, they participate in an awful lot of air shows and things throughout Europe and stuff. But again, not what I would call gainful employment for these guys. Air Transport Command is fundamentally a big difference. So we have 4 squadrons over there. We have 426, which is a long-range squadron, and the 4 Dakota squadrons you see there. 1 or 2 of them that we bring back over from, or we transfer back over from the Far East as soon as we can, and stuff. And they are all grouped together. So basically, 426 squadron, which is operating Liberators, is in Tempsford. 435, 436 at Down Apney, and then 437 at Otahan. There will be detachments that are scattered throughout England, scattered throughout Europe, depending on their requirements, their transport requirements and everything and stuff, but those are really their primary bases. There's also a 168 squadron, which operates from Canada, and it is one that comes back and forth and does some work in Europe and stuff like this. And this is outside of the occupation forces. So this is strictly a Canadian commitment. Now, the long range squadron that's stationed in Europe, it is fundamentally shuttling people back and forth from the Far East and back and forth from Europe back home. So that's sort of the kind of missions it's doing. It's basically primarily a personnel and mail run. The Dakota squadrons, or correction, this is still the long-range squadron. I just wanted to show this picture, especially the one on the right, because you can see the lap of luxury these guys travel in when they were traveling first class on a Liberator. The Dakota squadrons were probably the workhorses of the air commitment that the RCAF had to the occupation forces. They were by far the most, they were by far the busiest, starting off by bringing repatriated prisoners of war and wounded back home, to carrying cargo and stuff to the various locations to forward support the forces that were moving into Germany and that sort of thing. So they were constantly busy doing their primary function, which was the transport of personnel. So here it is. Very quickly, air routes were assembled to allow for the different air forces and the different transport organizations to function efficiently and stuff like this. So all these things were beginning to come into place very, very quickly right after the war and stuff. But the one thing that was probably occupying the minds of most of the RCAF personnel that were overseas was, when do I go home? And that was the big thing they wanted to do. And this led to a series of incidents, depending on what source you say. There were either incidents or there were mutinies, sit-down strikes, call them what you will. But fundamentally, it was the transport squadrons that got the ball rolling when approximately up to 2,500 personnel basically said, okay, it's not that they had enough, they just wanted to know when it was all going to end. Because by 1946, they were saying, hey, why am I still doing this when the Brits could be here doing this, when the other allied nations were getting their air forces back up and running? Why am I still here doing this job? And the second bullet that I had there, that 1/5 of the occupation force was volunteers. So that means 80% of the occupation force were people with low priority numbers, or people that had come over from Canada. So these were people who were saying, hey, I want to go home. It's and there has, up to this point, there had been no firm end date put forward by the Canadian government. So they really wanted to know. All of the incidents ended without violence or anything. And although there were, depending again on what source you see, they were either considered to be major issues or minor issues. it was definitely one of the things that helped cement the idea in the government that we have to bring these people back as quickly as we can. And you'll see from this point forward is basically the Canadian government really pushing hard to end all of its commitments to the occupation force. Now, the other one that I really found fascinating was looking here was air disarmament. I had no idea until I started doing the research that Canada or the RCF was involved in air disarmament. So 8402 RCF air disarmament was going to be our primary air disarmament commitment. So we were late to the party. By the time we decided we were going to make this commitment, and this is a commitment over and above the 11 squadrons that we promised for the occupation forces. We didn't make this commitment until basically February 1945. So by the time we got everything organized and stuff, we were pretty well late to the party. So almost 400 of us, 400 Canadians were part of the disarmament wing. There were 3 squadrons. Flak was not going to be an issue. We were going to deal with any flak issues. That was all going to be provided by an RAF detachment that was assigned to the wing. And they arrived on the continent on May of 1945. So this gives you an idea of the individuals that were belonging there. Now, their names and stuff aren't that important. Excuse me. What is the level of rank that we provided, the fact that we were in command and provided the key staff personnel to a group headquarters, and again, because we deployed our wing. Now, if you take a look at in brackets, I have their occupational specialties, and that's really kind of interesting. So if you see GD, that's general duties, usually means air crew in one way, shape, or form. But then if you take a look, we have equipment specialist, we have armament specialist, intelligence specialist, and signals specialist, which are the kind of occupations you would think would be very, very important when it comes to disarming a modern Air Force, especially if you're looking at, shall we say, borrowing as much technology and knowledge as you can from a defeated enemy. And again, on the other side, you have most of the individuals that are in the air wing are all general duty officers. Now, this slide is a little bit hard to read, but what it does is it gives you a good takeaway of how many different air disarmament units the RAF put in the field. And out of all those told, there was about 8,000 RAF personnel dedicated to air disarmament, of which Canada provided roughly 6%. So we weren't big players in this, even though the Brits had said, oh, we don't have the people, we don't have the people. Well, they found the people from all these other units that they were disbanding. So they managed to put together or cobble together a pretty formidable air disarmament organization. Now, we had no say because if you remember my organization slide, we fell under British command and control. So we actually had no say about where the wing was going to be located. And as it turns out, we got located in the upper right corner, which is not really part of the Canadian occupation force area. So again, it seems to be part of our history that we, for whatever reason, we seem to do or find ourselves being as far away from our sister services as humanly possible. So we were basically up in the Frisian Island area and up in that part of area in Germany and stuff like this. So the air disarmament guys, they had a fundamental mission was basically to take a look and see about disarming the Germans, of course, but also about dealing with all of their technology and weapons and stuff. So these are the different categories. So Cat A was basically intelligence and technical research. So think of it as jet aircraft, the radio controlled bombs, all that sort of stuff that was on the cutting edge of technology. The Allies, all the Allies, including us, wanted to get our hands on. Cat B was used by occupying power, so that would basically be German transport assets, German vehicles, German equipment that the occupying forces could actually use. Cat C was other theaters of war, so armaments, bombs, any sort of guidance technology and navigation technology that might be used in the Far East was good. Cat D was material you could give or provide or transfer to the liberated countries. This was stuff that they could use to help feed their people, help get their industry back up and running and stuff. Cat E was special handling. So this would have been stuff like not nerve gas, but gas warfare weapons and all that sort of stuff. Things that required specialists to come in and deal with, and you couldn't be done by the disarmament guys in the field. And finally, the Control Commission, Cat F, is stuff the Control Commission wanted. And that was primarily documentation and stuff that would help identify those individuals who either wanted for war crimes or individuals who might be significantly high up in the National Socialist Organization and stuff like that, so the Control Commission could deal with them. But those were all sort of the mandates and areas that the disarmament guys were looking at. So from the perspective of Canada, and Canada was like every other nation, every other victorious nation, we wanted a share of the booty. And this is should not be confused with reparations. Reparations was something completely different. This was us basically taking booty. And that is a technical term that you find in a lot of the documents. This is military booty that we have a right to as victors to take home. So we wanted war trophies, such as the German aircraft here that is in the National Collection in Ottawa. We were very interested in those other three areas. We wanted radar technology, we wanted communication technology, we wanted navigation technology. So we were really interested and sent over teams from the National Research Council, the Defense research establishments from Ottawa over to Germany, specifically to work with our people to get information and technology in those three specific areas. And this gives you an idea of the number of targets and things that we see. So you get a sense of how busy the guys in the field were. So if you take a look at the the second or the first yellow line at the bottom, so we had basically 404 different targets, and these would have been air bases, dumps, factories, collection areas, all those sort of areas that we would have wanted the RCF Air Disarmament Wing or Air Disarmament Squadrons to go out and visit, catalog, see what was there, and then arrange for that material to be transferred according to the ABCDEF criteria and stuff like this. And then there was phenomenal number of things out there. So just in the group alone, you would have seen we had 1,582 designated targets, and those were only the ones we knew about. So there were a whole bunch of ones who went, hey, what's in that barn? And we went over there and found some other cool stuff. And it must have been a surreal experience for these guys to go. And I love these two pictures, because the picture on the left is basically you have an RCF tourist on the left-hand side taking pictures in Bremen. And you have basically Kriegsmarine, and you have some Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht personnel all just watching this individual take pictures. And on the right-hand side, especially if you were in Coastal Command, you have take a look at them building, this is a hull section for a Type 21 submarine. So basically all of these things would have been just there. And so the RCF and their Army and Naval counterparts would have been trying to discern these things, take these things, and decide what is useful and what is not useful. And then we had to deal with the actual disarming of the personnel. So getting rid of tons and tons of ordnance, dealing with the equipment and machinery and the personnel. If you take a look at there, so one of the things that the Eclipse plan said was every service is going to be responsible for processing its opposite number in the German forces. So the RAF was responsible for the German Air Force. So fundamentally, as we processed almost 1 million people in that year or so right after the war ended, in order for them to be processed, identified, and then sent back into the workforce. And we ended up employing a lot of the German personnel to help us out as part of our air disarmament duties and helping us get some of the airfields up and running. So unbelievable amount of work just for this sort of stuff. And then we had war crimes. Now, war crimes was an RCF driven requirement. We worked with both the Canadian War Crimes Organization and the Allied War Crimes Organization. And this Wing Commander Oliver Durden was basically our primary prosecutor when it came to war crimes. Now, when Canadians think of Second World War crimes, we tend to think of Kurt Myers. Here he is getting a ride in an RCF Dakota. So basically, we think of that particular trial, but the RCF undertook its own series of trials, primarily held at Urich, Germany in 1946. And these were individuals who we specifically wanted to deal with because they had been found responsible for the execution of RCF prisoners of war or RCF downed airmen and stuff like this. So these were the ones that we dealt with specifically, and we wanted to make sure that we dealt with them specifically and stuff like this. Now, there was a number of them, but I'll just give an example here. So these are 3 individuals who were found guilty of shooting a downed airman. So an individual parachuted out of a bomber and then was executed once he was on the ground. So basically 15 years, and 2 were sentenced to death. And the death sentences were carried out by firing squad or by hanging. And to my knowledge, there were several executions. I'm still digging into that subject area matter, so stuff. So, but the RCF conducted its own series of war crimes. Now, this was still a very dangerous part of the world, and the operations these guys were undertaking was still pretty dangerous. So when I went on to the Canadian Virtual War Memorial, and I recognize it's not a perfect source, but it's an accessible source, I took a look at the number of Canadian airmen that were killed between the 9th of May 1945 and the 15th of June, which basically was when the mandate for the occupation forces fundamentally came to an end. And so we see 430 RCF personnel lost their lives. A big chunk of those would have been killed in the Far East because there was still a shooting war going on. But there are 130 of them lost their lives in Europe. And if you take a look, the biggest chunk of them were lost their lives in May 45, because again, you're winding down, still lots of Canadians overseas. You're still doing some operational flying and operational training, and then it sort of peters out and stuff like this. So quite that decreasing line, if you will, was expected. But I was surprised that 130 were killed or lost their lives. And this shows you, this sort of breaks down to where the most dangerous occupations were. So if you take a look at it, if you were in transport, that's probably the most dangerous, followed by fighters. And I found fighters interesting, but again, most of these individuals would have been killed air shows or unknown causes. Most of them would have been attributed to the catch-all of pilot error and stuff like this. So there were 87 of them killed in flying accidents. And probably the most dangerous aircraft would have been the Lancaster, but that's probably not true. It just means that every time we lost a Lancaster, we lost a whole bunch of people and stuff like that. Now you have death by misadventure. 2 of those death by misadventure involve self-inflicted gunshot wounds. And I have a funny feeling that some of these other deaths in here, such as accidents and car accidents, might have been attributable to suicide as well too. So again, those are the kind of casualties that we tend not to dwell on, but there's probably far more than we acknowledge at any one time. And we lost some interesting personnel, such as Clearsey. So 401 Squadron, DFC and Bar, 14.5 victories, and he was killed at basically he was up on a training mission and his aircraft plowed into the ground. No idea why. And then this is one of the suicides, Flying Officer Robert. He was a signals officer. Again, he'd served throughout most of the war, and he shot himself on the 22nd of May. And then you got this poor bastard who drowned on his honeymoon. So sometimes it's just bad luck. So by June 1946, the RCF's participation in the occupation, basically virtually all of the Canadian participation in the occupation of Europe, comes to an end. Why? Tasks are winding down, the incidents have happened and stuff like this. And so the government really wants to end it all. You also have the cost. I mentioned it was estimated $100 million. I don't have an exact breakdown of the actual cost, but it was significant. And then you have domestic opinion. We get lots of people already in the government saying, how come Johnny's still overseas when everybody else has come home? So you combine that with King, who wanted basically to reduce government expenditure, not really big on a commitment in the first place. And by June 46, everybody's coming home, even though the Brits are really pushing hard to keep the Canadians there for another year. But we wind everything down in 46. So here are a couple of concluding thoughts. So obviously, still got more work to do. The functionalism versus domestic politics is really interesting, and one that I see translates today, in that even though we love to wave the flag and we love to say, hey, look, we're participating because it plays well with domestic politics, we really don't contribute enough to give us a voice at the table in whatever we tend to do. I think some of the non-combat roles that we explored in the disarmament and the stabilization of Germany after the war will be quite worthwhile when we take a look at how the RCAF might participate in dealing with a failed state. Yes, there could be combat, but you should also spend as much time examining and perhaps planning and recommending non-combat roles for the Air Force as we go forward. Take a look at the way the RCAF does business. It is amazing how we love, and we still do to this day, is we put our operational command and control under the hands of other air forces, and we are quite content just to keep the administrative functions close at hand, but we're okay if somebody else commands Canadian Airmen. We still provide squadrons and personnel rather than completely formed organizations and stuff. And as I mentioned earlier, the flying versus non-flying roles, sometimes the non-flying roles, like in this case, air disarmament, are as important or even more important than the flying roles. Okay, these are some of the little holes I still have to do research on. If anybody out there has any understanding of 1945 patent law, I'd really love to talk to you. Because one of the things that I've seen in some of the documents, especially from the Americans and the Brits, not so much the Canadians, is, hey, are we allowed to steal this technology? Because prior to the war, a lot of multinational corporations set up industry and businesses in Germany. The war is over. We've conquered Germany. Now this plant, say it's a Coca-Cola plant, we've taken it over. We're going to steal the secret Coca-Cola formula. And all of a sudden, you've got the parent company back in New York City going, wait a minute, that's still protected by, our rights and everything under patent law. So I'm really curious to figure out a little bit more about patent law. The research reports, even though I know I can identify individuals from the NRC and the defense research who went over in Germany, I have yet to access the reports. Part of that was due to COVID. Part of that is due to actually trying to find the right box in either the Archive, Library and Archives Canada or the defense or NRC files and stuff like this. So, because I really want to identify the material that was brought back to Canada and to see whether or not it was actually integrated into some of the work we did, especially say for navigation, communication up north and stuff like LORAN and all that sort of stuff. It'd be really interesting and fascinating to see if indeed we did it. And ladies and gentlemen, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Like I say, do one bad thing to the Army Navy every day and then run like hell. Thank you very much.